Hello, welcome back to Fuller Exegetical. I'm continuing my series on comparing scripture to some of the claims of young Earth creationism and seeing how those two things line up. In the past weeks, we've talked about Genesis 1 through 11, from the creation accounts to the flood narrative to the Tower of Babel and everything in between. And we've covered how what Genesis actually says doesn't always line up with some of the young Earth creationist claims. This week, we're moving into the New Testament, and actually we're going to be discussing how the New Testament authors reference these early chapters of Genesis and how they're using those references. Now, the young Earth creationist claims to keep in mind this week is really just one, and it's that these New Testament references, or at least some of them, affirm the historicity or the historical accuracy of these early chapters of Genesis and require literal, historical, scientific reading of these chapters of Genesis. Now, the first New Testament passage that we're going to be covering is the genealogy in Luke 3. Yes, we're doing one more genealogy, but only one, because I'm not covering the Matthew genealogy, because it only goes to Abraham, because I don't want to do two today, and because you can't make me. Now, Luke uses this genealogy tracing from Jesus back through the Davidic line, back to Abraham, back through Noah, all the way to Adam. And by tracing Jesus' line all the way back to Adam, he's tying Jesus and Jesus' narrative not only in with Israel's history, but with the history of all humanity, and tying Jesus into the story of all humanity, and so making Jesus' message and Jesus' saving work to be universal for all peoples. And you'll see Adam functioning in this way as either a stand-in for all humanity or being used to tie things in with all humanity throughout the New Testament. And it makes sense because Adam is the father of all humanity. And even the language of Adam's own name, as we'll get to in a moment, speaks to tying this character of Adam in with humanity at large. And so this genealogy is functioning in some ways a lot like other genealogies we've talked about, in that it is tying characters and narratives and time periods together. It is making a theological and cultural statement. Luke is speaking, or writing rather, not to Jews only, but to Jews and Gentiles. And so throughout his gospel, he's tying Jesus' story and Jesus' message into the larger human narrative rather than just Israel, and making a point to make it clear that Jesus' message and the salvation through Jesus is available and is for all of humanity. Now, while that doesn't discount or require that we read this as non-historical, it also doesn't require historical reading, and it shows that the function of the genealogy is not to do history, but is to tie these two stories together and is to make a theological statement about Jesus' work. The next passages I want to cover are Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15. And I'm covering these together because Paul in these passages is making a similar argument, and he's using a lot of the same Genesis imagery in the same way. Now, in these passages, Paul is using the character of Adam, but he's using him as a type character. And that's not me using some kind of academic jargon or overanalyzing the text. Paul says that. In 5:14, he says that Adam is a type of the one who is to come, that being Jesus. So we know that Paul is using Adam in this way as a type of Christ. Now, what does that mean for Adam to be a type? Well, to be a type character is to be a character that functions in a similar way and can be compared to another character. So in this case, Adam, being the first created human, but importantly here, the first to sin, and therefore the entrance of sin and death through sin onto the scene of the human story, is then compared to Christ, who is the beginning of this new life, new creation, and salvation through Christ. And they're compared in this way, and importantly, Paul is holding up the consequences of their actions for all of humanity. For Adam, the beginning of sin and the reign of death. For Christ, the consequences of his faithful action is salvation and life and righteousness. Now, to understand what Paul is doing here, we need to understand how he's using some of these words. How does Paul understand sin? How does he understand death? How does he understand the person and character of Adam? Now, the way Paul uses sin is really threefold. First is that sin is referring to the collective sinning of all of humanity, as well as any individual person in the sins that they commit. And this is the pretty straightforward way we would tend to think of sin. The second way that Paul speaks of sin is sort of the reign of sin, and this is sort of the systemic implications of sin when it becomes widespread in society. It is the systematic evils of sin and its consequences. The third way that he talks about sin is as a spiritual reality and a spiritual force of temptation and corruption. Although it's important to note that he never speaks of this spiritual force of sin as taking over the responsibility for human sinning. It is always falling on individual humans. We bear the responsibility for sin, although there is this spiritual reality to it, which is, in some sense, beyond humanity. And Paul says that through sin comes death, but how is Paul understanding death? Well, Paul uses death both to speak of what we think of physical death and as a spiritual reality. And so in speaking of physical death, he speaks of the death of the body, and because of that, he speaks of actual bodily resurrection, countering some points of people during his time who were speaking of a purely spiritual resurrection. And Paul makes the point that it is actually bodily resurrection. But he also talks about death in a way that's certainly not physical death, that is a spiritual sense. And he does so in two ways. The first is spiritual death. It is a state of being, of painless and pointless living, to be under sin in all three senses that we just talked about. And the other way he talks about death is the action of dying, which again can be physical, but also he uses it to talk about turning away from things, to turn away from sin, specifically to die to sin. It's a dramatic and final way of speaking about completely turning oneself away from something. And these are the ways that Paul uses death most often. And so we can see that when he talks about life and death, as well as light and darkness, he's not always using them in the literal sense, and we may need to unpack his meaning. Now, one thing that this understanding of death does for Paul is it answers a bit of a perplexing question from Genesis 2 through 3, which is where we see Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and they were told that they would die if they did that, and yet they survive in the narrative for centuries afterwards. And this can be a bit confusing, because shouldn't they have died sooner or immediately? Well, Paul's understanding of spiritual death offers a bit of an answer, that they did die spiritually as soon as they ate the fruit and began this living in this state of pointless, fruitless toiling and pain and living under sin and death. And that for Paul is again tying in with his use of Adam as a type of Christ and the consequences of sin. All this is not to say that for Paul, spiritual and physical death are entirely divorced. They are certainly still related, and in fact, physical death adds a finality to spiritual death. But some scholars would even say is a merciful aspect of bringing an end to this living death. But in any case, they are still related, and physical death being its ultimate, eternal, final end. But how is Adam to be understood in Paul's writing? Well, even in Genesis, the person and character of Adam is a little bit ambiguous, and intentionally so. The word for Adam can be translated a few different ways. It can mean the character, the proper name, Adam. It can also mean man. It can also mean humankind. So it could at any point refer to a particular person with a name, unnamed individual man, or all of humanity as a collective. And different translations handle that differently, but that sort of wordplay in Genesis does get lost as it gets translated out of Hebrew. And I think this, again, adds light to why Adam so often functions as either a stand-in for all humanity or as a mechanism for tying other narratives or other characters into the story of a universal humanity. For Paul, as I spoke about earlier, Adam is the beginning of sin in the sense that he's the first sinner. Now, in that he's also the first created human, again, this ties the experience of sin in universally with humanity. This is something that all humans experience, and all humanity can see themselves in the story of Adam as falling to sin. Now, some things that Paul did not say. First, that Adam's sin somehow passed his guilt on to all his descendants, to all humanity, or that his actions somehow poisoned the well and doomed humanity to follow in his footsteps. That sort of reading of Paul really started with Jerome and Augustine and doesn't really seem to line up with what Paul is actually saying here. Yes, Augustine did get some things wrong. I said it. Second thing that Paul didn't say is that humanity or all animals or all life, depending on the version you want to take, was originally immortal, and that mortality or death only came onto the scene after Adam's sin. It doesn't line up with Genesis, and it's not anything Paul says here. He's using death a bit differently. What Paul does do, as I said, is use Adam as a foil or a contrast to compare the consequences of sin for all humanity in Adam to the consequences of Christ's sacrifice and saving work for all humanity to bring salvation and life and righteousness versus sin and death and corruption. Once again, this is a theological argument and not a historical one, and not one that depends upon us reading Genesis historically or scientifically. To move on from there, 2 Corinthians 11:3 does make a reference to Eve. Paul makes a passing reference to the narrative of Eve and the serpent, and he does so using that narrative sort of as a shorthand allegory for deception and the possibility of the church being deceived by false teachings. And that's what he's warning them against. He's warning his readers against false teachers and false teachings, and using the language of the garden and of Eve being deceived by the serpent. Now, to bring us to something a bit different, in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul references the creation account, and he does so sort of in reiterating a common thought or a common argument of his time. And that is that men should be seen as above women or having priority over women to some degree because men were created, Adam was created first in the image of God, and Eve was created second from the man. So Paul restates this argument, but then he sort of undermines it and throws it out immediately afterwards, basically stating that that may be the way things are in the sinful world, under sin, under death, but in the Lord, in Christ, things are different. He grants that the woman was made from the man, but then states, but men are born through women, and ultimately all things come from God. And so the distinction that was made in this common argument he's addressing is smoothed over. And of course, in this passage, he's talking about head coverings during prayer, and he does say that women should have their heads covered in prayer. But he moves away from this argument that it's due to some priority from the beginning of creation and moves it back towards social expectations and social norms and sort of not stirring the pot and causing problems, and even moves into judge for yourself. Does nature teach this to you? It's very complex and multi-layered, as Paul tends to be, but again, this isn't a historical or scientific account of history. It's retelling this common argument that's based on the Genesis account, and then turning it and sort of undermining that common understanding. Now, of course, Adam and Eve aren't the only characters from the early chapters of Genesis that are referenced in the New Testament. Noah is as well. And I want to talk here about Matthew 24 and Luke 17. Those are two accounts of Jesus giving basically the same speech. Now, Jesus references the time of Noah in these passages, and he does so when talking about his return and when he will come back. And he uses the time of Noah to give an example of the unexpectedness of his return, that his disciples will not know when he's going to come back and will not expect the time, and so they have to be ready, just as the people of Noah's day didn't expect the flood or know exactly when it would come. Even Noah and his family did not know exactly when the flood would begin. They just had to be ready and be faithful in what they'd been given. And that's the point that Jesus is making here, that just as with that, his disciples are to be vigilant and to be ready and to be faithful, even though they do not know when the time will come. And again, this isn't something that relies on historicity. Jesus is using the imagery of that narrative to talk about something else. And that's the common theme we're seeing with a lot of these references to these Genesis chapters, is they're taking the imagery, the characters, these narratives, and using those theologically or allegorically to talk about other things. And even where maybe that's not strictly the case, even with the genealogies, they're making a theological point to tie Jesus back into the common human story, not just with Israel. And none of these arguments are predicated upon a historical scientific reading of Genesis, and certainly none of them make such a claim outright. And so we need to be careful about insisting that these Genesis, or these references to Genesis, are affirmations of the historicity of those early chapters. And I think, again, as I've said in past episodes, if we can set aside some of these modern questions about history and science in the Bible, and instead take these passages and these narratives for their own meaning and take them on their own account with the questions and answers that they offer us, we can get a much richer and more interesting and more meaningful reading of these texts. And I think they can become much more beautiful in that sense. And all of that can get missed and muddied in the waters of modern scientific and historical debate. That's all I had for this episode. I know it's a bit shorter than usual, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. I hope you learned something. If I missed something, let me know. Next week, we're going to be delving into the historical interpretations of Christians throughout history of the early chapters of Genesis. So I hope you'll join me for that. But as always, thank you for watching.